All right, well, I'm expecting there's to be a lot of overlap, but we get to go first, so we're obviously correct. So what we really sat down to discuss, we didn't look at the list, we really were like, well, what can we get out of this meeting? We're all here, we're not going to be here for long, and so how can we implement something to continue past this meeting? And so our number one, which is why it's in bold, important issue is to, at the end of this, have a couple people, maybe the conveners, sit down and write a skeleton of ideas for how we're going to start to standardize our collection, our analysis, and as we said, from cradle to grave. So the idea is that we have 3 or 4 people write down a skeleton and then email it to everyone that attended this workshop, so that each person here could then add in something. So, and maybe this would be happening also through the V-Hub or something, but some way that it would be organized so not one person is responsible for 100 people emailing them with suggestions and ideas, but some way that at the end of, maybe the next few months, we would have a pretty good working skeleton, which would then be published for the whole entire community. Because one of the things that we were talking about is how we're missing a lot of people at this meeting. We're not having people represented from New Zealand or Japan or England. So, we can't say, this is what's going to happen, everyone leave it. A few people, we have a few people, the important people. That's not recorded. So anyway, the idea is that we need to just kind of take an initiative and start someplace. And so if we start with the skeleton of what we think in this room, we're a pretty good size of a much larger community, then we can have the community say, all right, well, we're trying to make an effort to get something out there. This is what we have so far. What are your suggestions? What are your ideas? And kind of make sure that we advertise this, get this out there so that not just a few people, but everyone is seeing that this is something that is happening. And then the end-all idea would then to be organized some sort of AGU meeting where we all get together, we say, this is what we have so far, this is what the last year, this is what we have come up with. And then we in this meeting are now going to either finalize this, we are going to say whatever we think is missing from this, and have some set idea at the end of it. So this was our first and main goal. There's overarching goals that are going to be a little bit harder to implement, but we can all agree that we need some kind of standardization within the community. And the only way for that to happen is to start somewhere. And this is a good-sized collective to start with, and then we will spread out, get people to get their input, and the only way it's going to work is if everyone gets, enough vigor and ideas to keep going. All right, moving on. Lunch. All right, so the second idea really, of course, is implementation, which is going to be challenging, and I wrote to be reevaluated once a standard has actually been made, so first step. But the idea is that, okay, well, maybe once we get this out, how do we implement it? How do we get people using it? Where is their motivation going to come from in order to actually use this thing that we have deemed to be the important issues, the basic information that needs to be collected, and maybe then the subsets of all of our fields, what information can overlap? So the ideas that we're kind of just throwing out there is maybe we could write a paper to initially get this out there, post documents on different individual websites, maybe Buffalo, maybe the different volcano observatories would be like, if you didn't know and you were going to go out and collect something, what should you be recording? What would be useful for not just your subset, but the whole field? And then spread the word also via listservs, or just getting the word out there that there is a standard, there are protocols, that we have some ideas. This is a way that, if you're out there in Alaska and you're just collecting for one issue, that maybe 2 or 3 other people might get some information out of it because of the fact that there are standards and different ideas for what could be recorded in each field site. And then lastly is the issue, of course, of a database. So as we heard earlier, there are a lot of databases. Each of you probably has their own database, but it's not easy. I mean, most of us probably don't even know the extent of the databases out there. And so the idea would be, well, maybe with the standardization, it would be easier to update into a database. But we shouldn't recreate the wheel, as we were saying. There are repositories out there. If we could somehow make a call for data, the bigger issues, of course, is that this is going to take more time. It needs to be maintained. There is going to be a lot more energy involved in trying to get this off the ground, but it needs to happen. We all know it needs to happen. There is a lot of data out there that we don't even know exists, and so if we can somehow call for people to send in their data to one source. And so our suggestions were that there are already repositories that we could utilize, and this would also then, if we can centralize it and then later on there's a standard, we can combine it all into one place. This is going to take longer, and this is a whole meeting in itself, I think. So that was why our first one was a skeleton is what we think we should take away from this meeting, and then this is something that needs to be worked on in more detail. Okay, questions? We worked hard.
That's really the whole. Oh, I see. It just hadn't loaded. Ah, okay. There we go. Okay.
We don't have a fancy PowerPoint, but it seems like there's going to be a running theme in these presentations, and so ours is along the same lines as Group 1. What we decided to talk about was how to standardize metadata in published data. We realized after some discussion that sampling techniques should be something that's taught and kind of passed down, and you can standardize sampling techniques, but sometimes in the field, desperate times require desperate measures of sampling, such as when you're being kicked off land and you need to collect it, and so my sampling technique is shovel as fast as you can into a quart-sized bag and run. So we decided that that's something that it is important to note in your publication. Okay, so we decided that when you're reporting your data in your publication, that's where you should be providing information about those samples. And we decided to kind of have a three-tiered system of you have basically we want a spreadsheet that everybody uses, imports your data into the spreadsheet, and when you publish that data as your online supplemental material, because everyone should be doing this anyway with whatever Tephra you have, whatever sample you have. And so it's not an extra step in terms of your publication. And so in this spreadsheet, you would have your minimal data that you should be reporting, your coordinates, who collected the sample, where the date it was collected, just like basic information about the sample. And then you kind of have the better, like if you can add this information, that's great. And if you can even add this information, maybe a photo or something, that would be even better. And so the reason why is because it would provide clarity and presentation of this metadata. Everyone would have the same way of reporting the data in all journals and all systems. And like I said, we're already kind of doing this anyway. We all have our own way of throwing a table together to submit to whatever journal we're doing. So we're already kind of doing this. And so it wouldn't be that difficult, since we're already inputting data into that spreadsheet, to have one spreadsheet that everyone is using, and maybe with drop-down menus and such. And then from that, we have someone at our table doing the Tephra databases. This is an easy way then for people to mine data from these publications to input into Tephra databases. If it's all the same, we have all coordinates in the same cell. So in that sense, no, I don't submit data to Tephra databases. There isn't one for East Africa. But if someone wanted to create that, you could download my online supplement material and easily then input into a Tephra database. And I don't have to go to the website that they created for this database and then input it again. So it takes away another step and might advance our integration of all of the data into a master database or even more regional databases. And so then the creation, we were looking online at the AIDA website, and they had good templates for geochem and other standardized spreadsheets already, so using that as a framework. And then again, separating into minimal data that should be reported, what else could be reported, and what would be even better to report. And then distribution, I have IFC, AIDA, listservs, VHub, whatever way that we can, just distribute this Excel spreadsheet, just a very simple thing. And that Excel spreadsheet could then, be added for an electron microprobe or a dating or whatever other material or information that you have. And then we also thought about implementation, like how can this be policed? How can, would it be journals that would say, oh, we have these, standardized spreadsheets if you're reporting Tephra, or how do we let this be known that here's a way to report your information? So, you have a question? Yeah.
I just wanted to add to that. I mentioned this editors roundtable meeting that's coming up, and that's actually over the next sort of 3-4 months. We have money from NSF to compile best practices for different data types into a wiki that
Okay.
can find information. So that would be a good opportunity to, agree on some standards and have them basically out there, because that's where editors will be pointed from the journals to say, look, this is the standard that the data in this paper should align with.
Okay, yeah.
So I think, interestingly, the things that we talked about in Group 3 have a lot of overlap with what Group 1 and Group 2 talked about, actually, maybe not surprisingly. And I think when we started our discussion, we talked about how sometimes you look back at Tephra data that was collected 30 years ago, and you can't make sense of it, you don't know how good it is, you don't know where the samples came from, and it's really frustrating to be in that situation. So we would like to, going forward, have all Tephra data that's collected be just completely usable in all aspects. You can go back, you can reoccupy the site, you know exactly how good the geochemical data is, exactly how good the imaging is. And so we took a little bit more kind of nuts and bolts approach to the problem that Group 1 and Group 2 have both already talked about. And in part, I think in today's world, putting huge amounts of data, making huge amounts of data available is easy because there's supplementary data sets for most journals. And so really fully documenting things is not as difficult as it was 20 years ago. So, our focus was the concept of fully documenting methods and data quality in Tephra work from collection of the samples to the final analytical data. And really fully documenting all steps of the process. And that we should work towards some kind of standardization of methods. I think that's something that Group 2 really hit on. And having that available to everybody so that you don't have to write huge amounts of analytical methods in your paper. You can refer to a common document that we're all referring to. And then we did a little more kind of nuts and bolts work here, if I can figure out how to work this. Oh. Yeah, okay, it's gone. Oh, I see it, I see it. Okay. So we talked in a little bit more detail about a few different things that we thought were particularly important. And one is collection of the samples, and we talked a little bit about things that we really felt should be documented. So we kind of made a start on an outline, a skeleton of what would be in this document. So I won't go through all of these in detail, but the things that we thought were important were documenting the collection of the sample very carefully and the field site and grain size. And then sample processing, exactly how the sample was dealt with, so someone in the future can maybe use your same sample, but they know what's happened to it. You know, I treated it with HCl, or I separated it in a lab that wasn't clean, so maybe it's a little bit contaminated. And then, which is fine. And we decided that some people are going to deal with samples in a class 100 clean one, some are not. That's the way it is. And you just have to know that. You don't want to try to push everyone into exactly the same method of data collection. But, and then one thing that I hadn't really thought about, but one person at our table brought up, is the concept of imaging. You know, we all image our samples in lots of different ways, and I always think of imaging as a qualitative tool. You know, you image it so you can look at it and see what it looks like. But one of the people at our table brought up the concept that really image processing makes imaging a quantitative tool. And so maybe we need to think about having some standardization in how we image samples. And then finally is the quantitative aspect of our data. And we've talked about that a lot, and I think the idea of having that Nick Pierce brought up about coming up with some standards that we can use as a community is tremendously important. And I won't even get into the quantitative aspect of this because it's tremendously complicated, but I think it's something we really need to focus on as a community. So any comments from any other Group 2 people of anything that was missed? Or Group 3? Sorry. Yep.
Okay, so our group went through every question. But we came to the same answer for almost every subject of or set of questions, and that is basically we need more transparency in the data analysis, the recording of the data, and how it's presented, as well as the data uncertainties. Every topic seemed to come back to this. We need to be able to correlate between archaeology and crypto tephras and modern proximal volcanologists studying larger tephras, and to have transparency in how the data is collected, what the data is, what the uncertainties are, is really key to having a cross-disciplinary use of the data. Also, we need better continuing to improve the management and cooperation between databases as we increase the volume of data that we're producing from all the different groups. If we all dump into one single database, that's great, but we need to make sure it's manageable. And if we're going to have one database that draws on all the others and just uses those other smaller ones as input, then they need to be very cooperative. So it's kind of the same things that you guys have been saying. We did discuss standardization of methods and sampling and all of that stuff, but we could basically sum up all of our discussion by these 2 points. There needs to be transparency and cooperation between all the disciplines using the data.
Are you the hungriest group? Is that why we just really ran through it? Wait, that was. Yeah, that's okay. Here.
So, for a new perspective on the discussion here, we were thinking about correlation, and the 2 key themes that we came out with were standard techniques. We kind of discussed that there have been a lot of different things, geochemistry, different majors, minors, traces, everything that people already use for correlation, and that, again, having this transparency and knowing what other people are doing is one of the most important things. We basically, in terms of what you use to correlate, thought the more you have, the better. And it's a theme that's been relayed through so many different talks, so I'm not going to labor the point. But yeah, the more the better in terms of correlation, but at least knowing what people are using and using as much as you can. And then databases for sharing this with everyone. So both internally within Tephra chronologists and for other fields, people who don't care about what the grain size might be. They want to know what the age is and where they can find it for their records and what they're applying it for. So we had a lot of discussion about databases, and I guess we'll come back to this a lot later this afternoon in the more focused session. But we basically want them to be, or our ideal situation would have them where it's not that much more work for us putting the data in, that there can be some kind of benefits, particularly on the next slide, it just kind of mentions visualization.
using these different techniques. So like saying this morning with Tephra base, that if by putting in that data, you can then get some images and some other plots and other data out of it, that's a great incentive for people to use them, obviously. And there's all kind of other issues with intellectual property, and yeah, figuring out the empty fields. And I think that comes back to the standard practices. If we know something will be useful for other people, even if it's not as relevant to us, we can still kind of include that. And yeah, same as groups 1 through to 4, really.
Okay, we may not be the first and we may not be the best, but we are the last, so we get the last word here. So we started our conversation with this topic, and we started thinking about what is it that everybody can collect in the field that can let everybody know not only where the Tephra exists, what it looks like, where I sampled it, how I sampled it, but also where it doesn't exist. So if I describe a section and it doesn't include the Lockyer-C Tephra, that's also data, right? And then we started talking about statistics and using statistics, not using statistics, how to use them. But in the end, what we got to was the theme that almost everyone else did, I think. We framed it in the sense of best practices sheets. So these are, I'm a geochronologist, and I don't really know what the physical volcanologist wants to see. So can I have a sheet on the website that I can print out and write on the rain paper, take out in the field with me, and check a few boxes? When I get back, I can put it in. And the person who's an ion microprobe expert can demand from the Argonne lab all of the things that they need to properly report the Argonne data. And so if we put together a set of these sheets, and this is the list that we put together here, but I like the imaging one too. We forgot that. That's important. And they can be available on a website, then everybody could use them. So then the question is, what is the motivation, right? How do we get people to implement this? And I'm going to call this the Balco carrot technique, because Greg Balco, who's a geochronologist in terrestrial cosmogenic nuclides, wrote the Cronus calculator for people to put information about the surface exposure dating samples that they've collected into this calculator online. And the reason that they want to do this is because in the end, they get out a plot they can just pop into their paper. And in the course of doing that, everyone has to put some sort of minimum data into that calculator. So I think that the idea, I really like the Tephra base. I can't find where you are, but the idea of if I put my Tephra data into a database and I can get out a strat column is great. I think that's the kind of motivation that people need to do this. They have to get something back from it. This is also a case of be thorough, but also be aware. I didn't think of that when I was looking at that outcrop. And don't reinvent the wheel. A lot of this stuff exists, especially for geochronology tools already in the literature. Labs have their own, I run a microprobe lab, and this is how I think everything should be done best. So, we need to pull from the things that exist already. And then it's great that the databases are interested in this. And Kirsten, forgot about the fact that you said that there's this roundtable of editors. But I think that the critical piece is that we're all reviewing these papers too. And so if I, as a reviewer, can know what the Argonne community thinks, or I don't mean to pick on them, but the physical volcanology community thinks are the critical things to report in a paper, then when I get a paper to review, I can go to the best practices sheet and say, well, why didn't you report your primary standards? That's not in this paper and it needs to be. So I'm going to make one more suggestion, and I'm going to get in trouble for doing it. But what if we made a list of the best practices sheets that we thought were important, and then the people who are in the room that are really good at that technique can kind of make up a Google Doc that then could be on the web, and then they could be sort of in charge of gathering comments and editing that Google Doc. And I shouldn't do this, but I would be happy to do the radiocarbon one, because I think that a lot of people use radiocarbon, and it's important to do it well, and people are doing it too well, maybe, doing things that they don't really need to do. So that's all.
Well, thanks, everybody. Just to add a note to all of these group reports, looks like there is some kind of consensus, but it might be, as Steve said, slightly skewed by the last talks on databases. But we had planned to try to work towards a handbook of sorts, as a result of this meeting, and it looks like people are expressing, interest in that kind of thing. So I personally have long thought that would be a great thing to have, and so that I could just know that I'm collecting data that's useful to somebody else. So I would really like to work in that direction, and I hope we all can stick with it. That's one thing that's hard, is being able to keep devoting the time to it. Absolutely, yeah. I use worksheets all the time in teaching, like when we're looking at soil samples in classes, did you collect this piece of data and stuff? So.